This week on the photo book review, we're going over Gregory Halpern's big work, Zizzix, and talking about the use of ambiguity, even in a documentary approach to photography, and a new style of documentary photography that kind of collects like a documentarian, but composes like a novelist. Let's open it up and have a look. So here we have Gregory Halpern's book, Zizzix, with the name printed on the back. Pretty simply bound book. Its simplicity and its form does not indicate the simplicity of experience when viewing this book. It's a pretty straightforward book, simple colors, but simple binding and printing, but even more powerful because it just draws all the emphasis from the images. Gregory Halpern has an undergraduate degree from Harvard in history and literature, and he was mentored by several people. In graduate school, it was Larry Sultan. In undergraduate work, it was Chris Killip, who taught photography at Harvard. And Rogovin, a photographer, left a big impact on Gregory Halpern, Milton Rogovin, which I'll get at a little bit later. But currently, Gregory Halpern teaches photography at Rochester Institute of Technology, so kind of a mecca of the photo world, either technologically and artistically. But he's a photo book artist who's been categorized as a new documentary photographer. So one of the hallmarks of Gregory Halpern's work is he has an impulse of photographing like a documentarian in that he gathers materials. And then later on, through sequencing and image pairings, Gregory Halpern, that's the artistic voice that comes through, putting images in conversation with one another. So this book is the result of 7 years of work in LA and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Gregory Halpern's mentioned in the past that he kind of focuses on one project at a time, and alongside this project he was finishing up and continuing work on a book you might be familiar with, Omaha Sketchbook. But in interviews he's mentioned that he paused that to head out here to finish photographing. LA is a space that Gregory Halpern is really interested in, both its urbanness and its wildness. It kind of has these pockets of Eden and then these pockets of urbanization and blight. One thing interesting about the sequencing of this book is that it starts seemingly on the outside of the city, and then the viewer kind of goes slowly into the city, almost like you're approaching a pilgrimage. And I mean pilgrimage. This book feels very old world. It feels kind of vaguely religious and mystical. I think this is a good example of a shrouded character in these what feel like ancient landscapes. Halpern's also mentioned that he wanted kind of a biblical context for this work, something that felt old. Another interesting facet of this work is that there's so many different types of images, and when I work with students, I mention often that you don't have a cohesive project is not 20 to 60 images that are almost all the same, that are basically the same picture with small changes. An interesting project pulls on a diversity of images: landscapes, portraits, still lifes, images that give different feelings because of the way they're photographed or the time of day they're photographed. A diversity of images, types of images, brings dynamism to a work, not dissonance. 1,000 rolls of film, 5 years, and a Guggenheim Fellowship is what it took to make these images. But I think there's some unique qualities in this work. There's certainly a timelessness and apocalyptic quality to this book. Halpern references the genre magical realism, so there's something that's easy to connect with, something that's real to the viewer, but something also seems kind of mystical or off. And that hint of mysticism is highlighted all the more because everything around it is seemingly ordinary. So we notice the mysticism even more. I initially thought this book was kind of a photographic version of a Killer's album, whereas another book that I'll have to review, since I'm mentioning it so much, Omaha Sketchbook, is more like a Strokes album. So this is kind of like a Sam's Town or Hot Fuss in the visual style of these images and the location, kind of this harsh environment that Halpern's bringing us into from the outside and then taking us into the city, kind of behind the walls. Something that shows up frequently in this book in particular, but most of Halpern's photo books, is portraiture. In this book, he's photographing people that he's walking by in LA. Like I said, he kind of photographs like a documentarian. He finds things and he catalogs them, and he finds people and photographs them. And because of the level of poverty in LA, I would imagine him walking around the streets kind of behooves itself to that as a subject. But something in interviews that you see Halpern addressing a lot is this potential of exploitation or discomfort in photographing subject matter that you might not feel you have the right to, or you maybe feel troubled with, or you're worried about a viewer maybe feeling uncomfortable. Halpern has a deep concern, I think morally and politically, for the poor, judging by the interviews that I've read on Guardian and Magnum and Mac and podcasts on the Golden Hour. But he's also an artist, and he states one of the responsibilities of an artist is to create a vision. That ambiguity that he's creating with these images, he's creating a narrative, an ambiguous narrative. You're not meant to cleanly come away with a decisive meaning from this project. Halpern states that ambiguity is what's uncomfortable, and when you're not spoon-fed a point of view, that causes discomfort. But he kind of says that's all the more intriguing and necessary, that you see something in the middle or ambiguous or not playing to either side, and that gives room for interpretation. The book Zizzix is named after what was once called Soda Springs. It was a health spa founded in the early 20th century, maybe late 19th century, by a guy named Curtis H. Springer, who basically squatted on this land that had a spring. And he was bottling the water and selling it. And he fashioned himself as a Methodist minister and a doctor. He was actually neither. He was a person who squatted on the land and basically grifted everyone, but he was a total grifter. But he named his little enclave, the spa and the bottling spring, Zizzix, because it was what he thought the last word in the English dictionary was. And it's still today called Zizzix. It's now, I believe, federal property or state of California property. Something that is hard to miss in this book are gestures. We see a lot of hands in action. We see a lot of averted gazes or people using tools to see. We see a lot of hair in the backs of heads. So we see it, we're let in and we're shut out in a lot of these pictures. It feels like there's a vulnerability, and then it feels like there's an openness and a transparency. This is a good case in point, this kind of unhindered laughter next to this really violent broken glass. The contrast for me is what makes this book. The contrast and moodiness. It certainly feels like a dream, almost like a dream you might have when you're sick. But that is a hallmark of this book, and certainly something that Halpern wanted viewers to take away in this work. There's so many stairs in this book leading to nowhere or leading to somewhere off-site. In interviews, Halpern talks about finding contrasts in individuals, maybe someone who looks very hard and very soft at the same time, or very tough and very gentle at the same time. This is a great example of that, the way the color, the softness of the color meshes with the blueness of his eyes, but then you think this man's sleeping on the ground when we reorient the picture. His eyes are bloodshot. It doesn't seem like he's doing well. So this book's 75 pictures, I believe, and 64 pages. So there's a lot of double page spreads, and you get the feeling that the empty pages are actually used, not in the same way, but made of use in the sequence of this book. You start to notice, oh, why is this image on the left and why is the blank on the right? Or why are there two blank pages in a row? That's, I think, a really unique and creative use, to use the blank pages for a rhythm that's created in this book. What a troubling picture. I've always had conflict about this picture, because the man sleeping or woman sleeping outside seems dead or very unhealthy. And living in Philadelphia, I mean, I come across this too. Something that strikes me in reading these interviews, and Halpern's insistence that an artist have a voice and photograph to that end. You are the photographer and you're photographing the surroundings to compose something. In an interview with Magnum, he says photographs are truly never entirely fiction or nonfiction. And photographs have the potential to be more or less objectively truthful, but they don't have to, they don't get a break like painting. Paintings we understand to be completely the artist's vision. And photographs, we feel like they have some tie, some essence to reality. And it's the burden of representation. It's the burden of reality. But that contrast of taking slices of reality, cutting them up, and forming a narrative, I think that's what makes an artistic narrative. That's what requires interpretation, and that's what shows a voice and a point of view. You can do that with more or less documentary work. You can do it with entirely fictitious work, but it takes intent on the artist and the photographer. The time of day that he's photographing in LA is just beautiful. He mentions in an interview that when he photographs someone, he usually asks, he said 9 times out of 10, if he can make their portrait. And he leaves a business card with them with this email on it, so that if they want a copy, they can email him, and he's happy to send them a copy. But along those lines of portraiture and sharing pictures of subjects later on, Milton Rogovin, someone who left a big impact on Gregory Halpern, has a book called Triptychs, and it's an exceptionally powerful book. Rogovin photographed families and community members in Buffalo in the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s, and he shows all 3 of those images in one page spread. And the simple power of the portraits, like Halpern's, just make you, they just cut to the heart of things. I wish there was a more clear way to illustrate that, but this is a great example to stop on. I love showing this image in class to my students because it is photographically and aesthetically beautiful, but deeply powerful and filled with metaphor. We have this woman gently resting her hands in someone else's hands that are off camera. We have Christ on her shirt. We have all these crazy colors, the contrast in the woman's hands with the contrast in her skin, and just that gentle expression. It's just very human. I think that this book plays on human emotions really well. This is a woman that Halpern would see, it sounds like fairly regularly when he was out photographing, and she would dress exquisitely, whether she was going to the grocery store or to work, and she was an actress, and Halpern was able to coax her into some photographs. Just again, there's this diptych feels so intentional. We're able to see, then we're able not to see. There's a lot of accessible views and restricted views. This is actually, I credit this to a friend of mine who's a curator for showing me this. This image created the cover for this picture. So that's the polka dots are a reference to a specific picture. Plain checkers on the street. Halpern also states that there's a extreme nature within LA, that it's beautiful and it's Hollywood and it's gritty and sometimes violent. Another image that's a great example of should we react positively or negatively to this image. Are we more embarrassed looking at this man than he is himself? He's has a dirty face. He seems to be living in a park. I think this book questions those things really well. This man appears to be happy, but there's visual indicators that might make us feel uncomfortable to identify and be happy with this man in the picture. Oh, this is a great image. I love this one. Kind of denotes a span of time. We see a house gone and then a house raised. What's interesting is it's not the reverse. It's almost as though there was nothing and then there was something. And that's along with another biblical reference that I'll get back to. It's a Genesis account of creation, that there was nothing and then there was something. Along with Halpern's photographic style, we see these stairs going up off camera again. That is a recurring theme that parallels, I think, very well Robert Frank's use of jukeboxes. Jukeboxes in The Americans by Robert Frank are kind of used to punctuate the narrative, and it creates a good sense of rhythm and connectivity. I feel as though Halpern's doing the same thing with these images, these staircase images. What I was fixing to say before we came across that image is there's a growing collection of photographers who are either trained in history, in scholarly history, and in primary sources and bibliographies and research and making an argument. There's a growing list of those photographers. Gregory Halpern's one of them, Terence Simon, Byron Wolfe. Larry Sultan is influenced by anthropology, and I'm sure some history too, but that seems like an interesting vignette to me. This image, I was able to contact a friend who speaks and reads Hebrew. This is a prayer that is written in Hebrew script right here, and we see a Star of David. Kind of another vague religious Old Testament kind of reference. This is the only image that really anchors the book in a time period and a little bit of a place. Halpern says that he liked the idea of Hollywood, of the studios present in LA, seeming so small, as though they could fit into a subject's hand. Another contradiction or another contrast in this book. These were two people moving from one house to another. So there's that fact embedded in the picture. This is, by the photographer's admission, these are two people moving from one house to another, carrying their belongings and their dog. We know that because Gregory Halpern shares it in an interview. When we look at this book and we fall into the narrative and we suspend disbelief, these are two travelers almost on a pilgrimage. They have all their need. This man's in kind of a cloak, and it looks like, a wagon train that we would have seen going out west. I think there's that impulse again at play, that documentary we think is inherently objective. And you can have a methodology like a documentary photographer, but then what you do with those pictures later on kind of not complicates, but nuances or throws you a curveball on what photography can be. But there's an inherent contradiction, I think, that's interesting and satisfying in collecting like a documentarian, but then putting together pictures like an author would, a literary author. Lots of marks, lots of hands in this picture, in this book. Again, another viewing device like we saw earlier in the picture. This one looking upward. And then as we started from outside the city and we walked into the city like a pilgrim or an explorer, now Halpern's taking us back outside the city. Lots of photographs that show the brutality of the landscape. This image in particular, when Halpern was flying into California to photograph, he mentions flying over this fire. And then upon landing, and seeing it from the sky, and then upon landing, renting a car to drive out there to photograph it, to kind of bear witness and to include in the photo book. But this incredibly harsh environment that contextualizes the whole book, it starts and ends with this harsh environment. There are basically a who's who in this thank you column. Robert Adam, who helped and gave Gregory Halpern some feedback in this book. Justine Curlin, who will show up soon on this channel, one of her books. Todd Heido, Alex Soth. A lot of heavy hitters in this book. Robert Adams has a review for this book that I'll link in the show notes that he did for Aperture magazine. Raymond Meeks. This book is for A. That's a reference to his wife. And we end here. I think the key takeaway, before I get into that, I'll show you the other biblical reference. So there's a verse in Revelations that indicates what these stars mean. Revelations 1:16 talks about 7 stars being in the right hand. What is here, unless the negative's reversed, which I don't think it is. It's in the left hand here, but there are all these kind of those timeless biblical references in the book. I think a key takeaway in this book is there's a diversity of images in this book, images that feel different ways. And you're It's using all of photography for its best purposes. We have landscape here, we have portraiture. No images are really the same. They're not all still lifes, they're not all portraits, but we also have a diversity of practice. So collecting like a documentarian and putting together like an author or a painter. And that's not unheard of. Todd Hido talks about photographing like a photographer, but printing like a painter. So I think that diversity of methodology, the diversity of images present in this book, and the powerful sequence in this book. It's real simple. And the simple container makes the photographs all the more powerful. I appreciate Halpern's insistence that an artist have a voice and that an artist is out in the world gathering from the world to create a message, and they should be true to that. And this idea that photographs are never entirely truthful or entirely fictional, that they hover in this really ambiguous space. And that's something that makes them distinct of all the artistic mediums, is that they're pliable. Gregory Halpern, Zizzix or ZZYZX, dealer's choice. One of the takeaways for me in this book is the obligation that photographers have to the truth, but then the desire for ambiguity in work, and how that leads to discomfort in photography. That combination of ambiguity and truth and obligation, that's a mixed bag. But I think that makes work really interesting and worth chewing on. I also see, and I count Gregory Halpern in with this, a growing collection of photographers, Terrence Simon, Larry Sultan, Gregory Halpern, Byron Wolfe, who are influenced by history or sociology in their creative practice. If you've never heard of those photographers, look them up. They're awesome. And let me know in the comments if what you think of ZZYZX, if I missed something that you wanted to have mentioned. I'll see you next week, and I hope you enjoyed.